I used to believe Alzheimer's had stolen every memory from my grandmother. Until the day I saw her in a video tied to a chair, eyes burning, speaking clearly. I remember everything, and I won't let you get away. That was the moment I realized she had never forgotten. She was pretending. For 10 years, she played the role of a fading mind just to expose a network that turned people into test subjects. And I, the one who thought I was saved by chance, turned out to be living proof of what they tried to bury. If you think this is just a story about memory, you're wrong. Subscribe now for more haunting, emotional, and powerful storytelling episodes you won't want to miss. Martin Carter never lit the fire before noon. That was Evelyn's rule back when she was still around to make rules. Wood burns fast, not wise, she'd say with that half-smile, handing him kindling like she was passing down a legacy. And though Martin now lived alone in that creaking cabin on the edge of Tillamook Forest, old habits, especially the ones tied to her, died harder than most men. But that morning something felt colder than usual. Not the kind that settles on the skin, the kind that creeps into your ribs and lingers. He knelt by the hearth, one hand bracing his arthritic knees as he reached into the pine wood box. The logs were old split 2 seasons ago, dry, gray, just like everything else he owned these days. He grabbed the first log from the top. As he turned it over, a small crack split through the center, revealing a dark crease that hadn't been there before. Something papery, tucked inside. Martin squinted. His fingers still steady despite the tremor in his heart, plucked out a folded sheet browned at the edges, a corner charred like it had been halfway to ash. At first he thought it was trash. Maybe an old note tucked there by one of the grandkids years ago. But there was no mistaking that handwriting. It hit him like a sucker punch to the chest. Evelyn. Her script was unmistakable, sharp, and confident, even though her hands had started to shake long before they said she lost herself. It was the kind of penmanship they didn't teach anymore. You could almost hear her voice when you read it. Martin sat back the log, forgotten the cold floor biting through his jeans. He unfolded the page slowly. The ink had bled slightly from moisture and smoke, but the message burned clearer than any fire. If you're reading this, it means I failed. They lied. I was never lost. They're hiding something. Don't trust the staff. Not even the one with the kind eyes. Meet me. Northern tree line. 2 miles past the last ranger marker. Hurry, Martin. Please. Don't let them erase me. He read it twice. Then a third time. Each word drove deeper like frostbite under fingernails. She wasn't gone. She wasn't sick. Martin's breath caught. The same lungs that had chased down fugitives on foot, that had yelled orders through gunfire, that had whispered bedtime stories to a boy who'd grown up and vanished. Those lungs betrayed him. 3 weeks. That's how long they'd told him Evelyn had been missing. 3 goddamn weeks of search parties, yellow tape cops saying she probably wandered out. That's what they do the Alzheimer ones. And now, this. Martin stood. His knees protested. His heart thudded too loud, too uneven. But he didn't sit down. He walked to the counter, grabbed his worn leather wallet, and slid the letter inside next to a photo that barely looked like her anymore. Taken before her diagnosis, before the trembling, the confusion, the glassy stares that seemed to look through him. He opened the back door. The air hit like a slap, February Oregon cold. Pine needles iced over, sky the color of steel. But he didn't feel it. He was already moving. He passed the old Chevy Suburban in the drive, keys in the ignition. He paused just long enough to unlock the kennel beside the woodshed. The dog inside lifted its head slowly. One amber eye blinked, then the other. Come on, Finn, Martin said softly. Time to earn that vest. Finn stood stretching long limbs like a soldier waking from hibernation. Half German shepherd, half mystery, all muscle and instinct. The dog stepped out silent, his breath misting in the air like smoke. Martin didn't need to command him. Finn just knew. They moved back inside. Martin flipped the switch for the emergency sat phone. It blinked red, no connection. Of course. He pulled open the hallway closet, brushing aside winter coats, until he found the old go bag, packed out of habit. Out of paranoia, out of history he rarely acknowledged anymore. Water, flashlights, painkillers, a crumpled map of the Tillamook boundary range, a loaded Glock in a locked pouch, just in case. He slung the bag over one shoulder and went to the narrow staircase. Nora, he called up. Get dressed. 10 minutes. There was a pause. Then a groan. Seriously? We're going into the woods. A longer pause. Then her voice sharp, annoyed. You promised no more woods. You said that last time. Martin didn't answer. He moved back to the living room. The letter lay beside the log it had hidden in, still slightly curled from heat. Finn sat near it, not touching, but staring at the paper like it had spoken his name. Nora came down the stairs, still tying her bootlaces. black hoodie, half-zipped, headphones around her neck. Her eyes flicked to the fireplace, to the dog, then to her grandfather's face. She stopped cold. What happened? Martin handed her the note. She read it once. Her brows knit. She read it again, this time slower. Is this a joke? He shook his head. Nora blinked, but her mouth tightened. You said Evelyn had Alzheimer's. You said she... I know what I said. Finn let out a low sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a whine. She sent this. Martin's voice was rough. I don't know how, or when, or why it was hidden in firewood. But I know that handwriting. I know her. Nora folded the letter again, slower this time. She was 16, sharp, cautious, and maybe too old for how often she flinched at shadows in the trees. She said not to trust them, she murmured. The staff at the home. He nodded once. I thought she didn't even remember your name anymore. Martin exhaled. So did I. They stood in silence for a beat too long. Finally, Nora said, So what now? We just walk into the forest and hope she's camping with memory loss. She said northern tree line. I know that area. And if this is a trap... Martin's jaw locked. He looked at Finn. The dog was already at the door. The Suburban rumbled over the old service road tires, crunching gravel frozen into the earth. Pines loomed on both sides, brittle and tall like sentries watching an old man break his own rules. Finn sat in the back seat, his head turned toward the window, ears twitching at every rustle. Nora sat beside Martin, arms crossed, headphones, now blasting low music into her hoodie. But she wasn't listening. She stared at the glove box like it held the answer to a question no one had asked yet. I thought she died last year, she said finally. Not literally, just like when someone stops knowing you. Martin kept his eyes on the road. She remembered me once. Last summer, he said. We were sitting on the bench behind the rose bushes. She looked over, squeezed my hand and said, You came back. Just like that. He swallowed. 2 minutes later, she asked me my name. Silence again. Except the road and the tires and the ticking of the dashboard clock that had been broken since 2015. Why bring me, Nora asked. Martin slowed the car near a bend. Because she trusted you. Nora laughed dryly. She thought I was the neighbor's kid. Martin pulled the car over, shifted to park. You're the only one left, he said without looking at her. And if I don't make it back, I need someone who remembers why this matters. He opened the door and stepped out. Finn jumped down after him. Martin walked around, opened the trunk, and started prepping his gear. Nora stayed in the car for another 5 seconds. Then she followed. He handed her a small flashlight, a folded jacket, and a radio. She didn't argue. Finn was already moving. Not running, not sniffing, just moving, like he knew. They reached the trailhead by 6:42 a.m. It was still early enough for the fog to cling low to the forest floor, weaving around their boots like warning signs. Martin pulled the letter from his coat and read it one more time. Don't let them erase me. He folded it slowly. Finn turned toward the tree line, and Martin followed. The fire behind them still burned. But the real fire, the one in Martin's chest, had just been lit. The road narrowed as they left the last paved mile behind. Dense firs flanked them, crowding close like walls. Snow clung to the branches like breath held too long. Every turn in the forest road looked the same. If not for the tire ruts Martin had memorized decades ago, he might have thought they were lost already. He didn't speak much, hands tight on the steering wheel. But inside, something roiled. Nora sat beside him, legs pulled up onto the seat hoodie sleeves, covering her fists. She wasn't asking questions anymore. She was watching, listening. Not to him, but to the trees, to the space between each wheel crunch, to the breath of the forest. In the rear, Finn sat silent and sharp ears, twitching eyes, never quite relaxed. His nose occasionally lifted toward the air vents like he was sniffing something distant. Something the rest of them couldn't smell. They were 30 minutes out from the ranger marker Evelyn had mentioned in the letter, when Martin's mind broke from the present and tumbled backward. It had been the second week Evelyn was at Ridge Pines. She'd seemed calm, too calm. Martin had brought her a fresh robe, still warm from the dryer. She took it with a kind smile and folded it carefully, which in itself was odd. Evelyn had always hated folding laundry, called it domestic punishment. But that day, she was soft, polite, like someone playing a version of herself. Then, as Martin stood to leave, she'd grabbed his wrist. 12 needles, same spot, she whispered. 4 at night, 8 in the day. Not vitamins, not meds. Dreams like snow. Same faces every night. Her eyes, God, her eyes hadn't looked like that in months. Fierce, alert, real. He'd asked questions. She'd clammed up. A nurse had stepped in with that serene, scripted concern. Sometimes they fixate, she'd said. Stories that loop. Not real, but they feel real. But Martin had worked too many interviews with too many liars to mistake that look in Evelyn's eyes. She hadn't been confused. She'd been warning him. "You okay?" Nora's voice pulled him back. Martin blinked. "Yeah. No, I mean like you weren't blinking for a full minute. That's not normal behavior." Martin smirked faintly. "Neither is driving toward a dead woman who wrote me a letter last week." Nora didn't smile back. "Do you remember what she said?" Nora asked after a pause. He nodded. "About the needles, yeah. Did you tell anyone? Authorities, lawyers? Who the hell do you think I am?" Martin snapped sharper than he meant. "Of course I did. I took it to the state board, sent in a request for an investigation, and they sent a form letter. Said I had no medical proxy and no standing as legal guardian. Basically told me to get lost." Nora looked out the window again, but not before he saw the worry starting to wedge between her brows. Then she shifted. She reached into the side panel of the door, pulled Martin's wallet from the cup holder. "Hey, I'm not stealing anything," she muttered. She opened the wallet, sifted through. There, folded and fragile. She pulled out the photograph and held it to the window, letting the gray morning light fall across it. It was Evelyn, standing in the Ridge Pines courtyard, her face calm, her posture rigid. But it wasn't the photo itself that made Martin's throat dry. It was the object pinned to the back of her cardigan, barely visible. A small metal badge with a strange circular symbol. Half snake, half flower, curved like a spiral. Embedded in the spiral, the letters Nivexa. Nora turned to him slowly. "This mean anything to you?" Martin took the photo, leaned in. His heart tripped. Nivexa, a private pharmaceutical subsidiary. Back in his FBI days, he'd seen the name surface in one sealed report connected to a mental health trial that disappeared under the radar. "Nora," he said, voice low, "we're not just dealing with a care home anymore." The road ended at a gated forest path, rusted chain, no lock. Martin cut the engine. The silence that followed was heavier than the snow itself. They got out. Finn sniffed the air, then turned his head east toward the trees. Nora stared into the forest like it might blink first. Martin grabbed the go bag and slid the Glock into his belt. He didn't need to tell her to zip her jacket all the way up. She already had. An hour into the woods, the trees thickened. Nora pointed back suddenly. "Did you hear that?" He turned. "Nothing." Finn, Martin asked. The dog was still, rigid, nose low to the ground. His tail pointed straight the way he did when he sensed something off. Not danger. Not yet. But off. They kept walking. 10 minutes later, they found the clearing. The tree line Evelyn had described. A sloped ridge. Old ranger marker at the bottom, half buried under snow. The paint on the wood had long since peeled. If you didn't know it was there, you wouldn't have noticed it. They started setting up camp, just a tarp, sleeping rolls, and a small contained fire built into a rocky hollow. Martin unpacked the motion sensor Nora had insisted on bringing. She activated it, syncing it with her phone. No signal. But the sensor's local feed worked. They set it facing the path they'd come from, just in case. By dusk, the wind sharpened. A snow flurry moved in, not heavy, but enough to veil the trail. Martin had just started heating the water when Finn growled. Not barked. Growled. Low. Deep. Not from fear, but possession. Territory. "What is it?" Nora whispered. Finn moved to the edge of the tree's body taut. Martin grabbed the flashlight. They both followed. The dog stood still, nose pointed toward a low drift at the base of a pine. Nora shone the light over it and gasped. Half buried in the snow was a broken syringe. Plastic snapped at the barrel. No label. But inside, a sticky reddish residue clung to the walls. Martin knelt. No blood. Not fresh. But something about the needle gave him pause. Nora pulled out her phone, flipped open the lens on her pocket UV scanner. The area around the syringe glowed faintly green. "What the hell is that?" she asked. Martin shook his head. "Could be contrast dye. Could be trace pharmaceuticals. But it sure as hell doesn't belong out here." He looked around. "Someone dropped this recently." They both turned back toward the camp and froze. On the far ridge, headlights. A vehicle. Just for a second. Black. Silent. Peeking through the trees like an eye through a curtain. Then darkness. Gone. They ran back to camp. The motion sensor was blinking red. "Motion. 30 seconds ago. Northwest." Martin drew his pistol. "Get behind the rocks," he told Nora. They waited. No sound. No voice. Nothing moved. Only the wind and the flicker of something wrong settling over them like frost. "They're watching us," Martin said. Nora didn't ask who. She didn't need to. Finn stood between them and the darkness, his body still, his breath fogging slow and steady in the bitter cold. He never turned away from the trees. And Martin, kneeling behind the firelight, knew something Evelyn had tried to tell him years ago in a whisper. No one had believed. Memory is what they attack first, because it's the last thing that can fight back. The snow had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving behind a crust of brittle silence. No birds, no wind. Just the crunch of 3 sets of boots and the padded tread of a dog's paws, moving slow and deliberate through the trees. Martin walked in front, flashlight still clutched, though daylight was breaking. Nora followed Hood, up her gloved hand, gripping a small notepad she used to sketch trails. Odd markers or notes, things she didn't trust, memory to hold. Finn moved just ahead of her, nose low breath rising in rhythmic puffs. The footprints had appeared half a mile west of their makeshift camp. At first glance, they were nothing. Just indentations, uneven in depth. Some shallow, others sunk too deep, as if the walker had staggered or dragged a leg. But Martin knew how to read a trail. The pressure on the outer edge of each boot print. The erratic width between steps. And the strange groove trailing alongside it, like something had been dragged. He knelt at one. "Not Evelyn," he muttered. Nora crouched beside him. "How do you know?" He pointed. "Boot size is off. She wore size 6, narrow. These are men's, probably size 10, heavy, industrial tread." She studied the groove. "What do you think they were pulling?" Martin stood, eyes locked toward the tree line. Could be a sled. Could be something worse. He didn't say body. He didn't need to. They pressed forward. It took another hour before they found the cabin. It rose out of the forest like a misplaced bone, old, but not decayed. 2 stories, narrow porch, the shutters closed and nailed tight. A wire antenna jutted from the chimney, not rusted, not weathered. New. Martin noticed fresh chains bolting the front door, not weathered either. He paused near the edge of the porch. Nora stood behind him, mouth tight. Finn sniffed the bottom step and gave a single short bark, not alarm, but marking. Then he froze, ears flattening. His body dropped lower. "What is it?" Nora whispered. Martin's eyes scanned upward. And there, tucked behind a crooked plank of the porch roof, was a lens. Circular. Embedded in wood. Faint red glint. Motion activated. "Camera," he said. "But not standard hunting cam. This is corporate grade. Think someone's inside." Martin knocked once on the door. Loud. Solid. Waited. Nothing. Knocked again. Then said clearly, "My name is Martin Carter. I'm looking for my wife, Evelyn. I believe she was brought out here. If you're listening to this." A metallic click. Both he and Nora turned. But it wasn't the door. It was under them. Thump, thump, thump. Not footsteps. Knocks. Slow, measured, patterned. Martin stilled. His eyes sharpened. "That's not random." Nora pulled out her phone, tapping a rhythm analyzer. "It's Morse," she said, repeating pattern. "What's it say?" She counted beats, whispered SOS. Then HELP. Over and over. Finn scratched at the porch suddenly, then let out a muffled growl. Martin stepped back and crouched. There, between 2 warped floorboards, something shifted. Dust moved. A seam revealed itself. "Get the crowbar," Martin said. Nora rushed to the bag, handed him the tool. He jammed it into the crack, grunted with effort. The wood groaned. Gave. A trapdoor hidden beneath layers of false decking and dust creaked open. Stale air rushed upward, thick with mold copper and something else, iron sweet and rotten. They stared down into darkness. Finn descended first, agile and soundless. Martin followed, gun drawn. Nora came last, flashlight in hand. The room beneath was barely 6 feet tall, walls of poured concrete lined with makeshift insulation. Shelves of canned goods. A desk covered in empty syringes. A portable IV rig hung in the corner, the bag long dried. But it was the far wall that stopped them all. Paint, words, drawings, names, scratches. The entire concrete face was a tapestry of chaotic scribbles layered over each other, like a mind unraveling in real time. In the center of it all, written in what was unmistakably dried blood, was the name Evelyn. Nora let out a whisper, barely breath. Jesus. The drawings weren't just random. A woman in a bed with wires in her skull. A black dog at the edge of a forest. A face with no eyes looming over a cot. A figure, Evelyn, holding a letter and whispering through the wall. And above all that, in smaller script, "I'm not crazy. I'm remembering." Martin stared at it, frozen. This wasn't a place where someone had been kept. This was a place where someone had fought. Fought to stay tethered to memory, identity, truth. Nora stepped forward. Her foot tapped something hard. A small black voice recorder half buried under a blanket. She bent down, pressed the play button. Click, static. Then Evelyn's voice, calm, strained, whispered, "If you're hearing this, it means they're coming again. They think I forgot. But I remember. Not all of it, but enough. Enough to know this place wasn't just for rest. We weren't patients. We were property. Trials. They called it memory regulation, but it was theft. A soft thud in the background. Footsteps. They say I'm sick, that I wander. But I don't. I record. I hide. I map the floorboards. I track the doses. More static. They call it progress. I call it erasure. They wanted a blank slate. But I bled names into the walls, so I'd never forget who I was. Then, I'm not insane. I'm waking up. Click. Silence. Martin's throat felt like sandpaper. Nora leaned into him, voice trembling. She knew. She knew everything. He said nothing. His eyes moved again to the wall, where the spiral symbol from the photo reappeared, drawn over and over again in black charcoal, sometimes in blood. Finn growled softly and turned toward the far corner of the basement. Martin followed his gaze. There, hidden behind a canvas curtain, was a metal cabinet. Locked. Brand new. He pulled it open with a crowbar. Inside, stacks of sealed folders, plastic-wrapped. Martin grabbed one. The top read, Patient File Number 4827, Ian Carter Diagnosis. Early-stage Alzheimer's Consent, Delegated Power. Ridge Pines Board Treatment, Navexa X. Underneath that, Cognitive Transfer Procedure, Initiated Phase 1, Complete. Martin stepped back. His mind spun. Cognitive transfer. Nora read it too. You think they were trying to take her memories? Martin's stomach turned. Or suppress them. Or implant new ones. He dropped the file, breathing hard. Above them, the sound again. A vehicle. Engine. Tires on snow. Then silence. Martin looked up. Whoever owned this cabin knew they were inside. He grabbed the file, shoved it in his bag. Nora, he said, voice sharp. We move now. They climbed out, sealing the hatch again. Covered it fast. Covered the prints. No time for fire. No time for warmth. Martin, Nora, and Finn ducked back into the trees, just as the black SUV from yesterday crept up the path and stopped. Inside it, silhouettes. Watching. Waiting. But too late. Martin was already gone. In his pocket, Evelyn's recorder was still warm from her voice. The trail ahead narrowed into a frozen corridor between crooked pines where light barely filtered through. Martin slowed, hand tightening around the strap of his satchel. Nora kept pace behind him, her eyes fixed on the bag that now held Evelyn's patient file and the recorder that whispered with ghosts. I can't stop thinking about what she said, Nora finally spoke, breath visible in the frigid air. We were property. That wasn't fear. That was clarity. Martin didn't answer. His jaw worked, but no words came. He didn't want to believe it. Didn't want to think about what it meant. That the woman he'd once tucked into bed with warm tea whispering reassurances as her memory stuttered and fell away might have never been sick. That he had left her behind, based on a lie. A violent gust of guilt hit harder than the cold. They stopped at a bend in the trail where Finn suddenly veered right tail, stiff ears forward. He let out a low growl, not loud, but certain. Martin followed. Finn's nose led them to a collapsed hunting shed, barely standing, half buried under snow and branches. Inside, in a moldy crate, Nora found it. A medical ID necklace, tarnished, worn from use. She picked it up carefully. The engraved tag read, E3. Do not release experimental class, Navexa Group. Nora whispered, E3. Like Evelyn Carter, third subject. Martin took the tag, stared at it like it might start bleeding truth. They numbered her, he muttered. Nora looked up. She knew. She let them number her. He nodded slowly, or she pretended to. As the sun climbed a little higher, they settled beneath a hollow in the rocks to review what they'd gathered. Martin pulled out the small external hard drive they'd found in the cabin subfloor alongside the recorder and handed it to Nora. Can you open it without Wi-Fi? She nodded. Already downloaded an offline reader. Let's see what we've got. She hooked it up to her tablet. It whirred, flickered, then loaded. The first folder was labeled simply AudioViz, Session 9A, Dr. Lauren, Patient E3. Nora tapped play. The screen showed a sterile white room, no windows. Evelyn sat in the corner, wrists unbound, but hands limp. Across from her, a man in a lab coat, face partially obscured. He spoke softly. You're doing well today, Evelyn. Do you know what day it is? Saturday, she answered, but her voice was forced. Measured. You said that 5 times. I assume that's still the script. The man smiled. You're resisting again. Evelyn tilted her head. I'm remembering again. He sighed. You consented to the procedure, Evelyn. You signed the documents. We're trying to give you peace. You're trying to erase witnesses. The man paused. That's a dangerous assumption. So's drugging people to simulate dementia. He leaned forward. If your husband asks, what will you say? Evelyn met his gaze, cold, unmoving. I'll tell him what I always told him, that I love him. And I'll pray he's smart enough to know I'm not confused, just cornered. The video ended. Silence. Martin's hands trembled as he reached for the screen. He didn't touch it. She signed something, he whispered. She went in willingly. Nora nodded. To investigate, maybe even to expose them. But I told her to go, Martin said hollowly. I told her it might give her peace, that she was slipping. God help me. His voice cracked. Finn rested his head on Martin's knee without a sound. Nora put a hand on Martin's shoulder. She knew what she was doing. She used what they believed about her. Martin blinked back, heat from his eyes. She counted on me coming for her. Another video auto-loaded. This one from a hidden cam angle, shaky view obscured by curtain folds. It showed patients being injected. Silent, slumped, then rapid shifts. Some screamed, some smiled absently. One began to sing. And then the video cut to black. Underneath the video, a handwritten label had been scanned and attached. Note: NVX-43 trials induce targeted hippocampal disassociation. 3-day memory wipe successful in 87% of E-class subjects. Recommendation erasure followed by identity reprogramming. Martin stared. They weren't treating Alzheimer's. They were creating it. Nora tapped another file. They used the illness as camouflage. And Evelyn... Martin's throat tightened. She walked into it just to tear it down. They sat in silence, but only for a breath. Then came the sound. A low mechanical whine in the distance, getting louder. Nora froze. ATV, she said. That's not a snowmobile. That's an all-terrain medical crawler. Martin stood. We have to move. They packed fast. Nora stashed the drive. Martin double-checked the satchel, made sure the ID tag was in it. Finn stood still, facing the east tree line, muscles taut. Martin pointed toward the ridge. There's a shortcut down through the dry bed. It leads into the ravine. But the sound wasn't fading. It was turning. Following them, Finn barked once sharp. Martin motioned. Now, go. They sprinted down the hill, ducking under branches, weaving between deadfall. Nora stumbled once Martin caught her. Behind them, the ATV burst through the trees. Black, sleek. 2 riders. One with a helmet, the other not. The man without it held a tranquilizer rifle. Martin fired a warning shot. The rifleman didn't flinch. Martin fired again, closer this time. The ATV swerved, but stayed on their trail. They reached the dried creek bed, feet pounding over frozen mud and brittle leaves. Finn darted ahead, barking into the fog like a guide. Suddenly a cave mouth, not deep, just enough to hide. Martin waved them in. Nora slid first, then Finn, then Martin. They pressed against the rock wall as the ATV thundered past above them, unaware. Silence returned. Martin exhaled slowly. Sweat clung to his neck despite the cold. Nora looked at him, eyes wide. They're not going to let us leave with this. He didn't answer, because she was right. As dusk began its descent, Martin set a small fire inside the cave, tucked deep where the light wouldn't be seen. He warmed his hands. Nora leaned against Finn's side, his body heat steady. She reached into her coat and pulled out the recorder again. Pressed play. Evelyn's voice returned, this time softer. Like a bedtime story. When I was 6, I got lost in the orchard behind our house. I stayed there all night. Everyone thought I was gone. But I wasn't scared. I sang to myself. I counted stars. And in the morning, my mother found me because the dog never left the tree I'd climbed. Martin closed his eyes. So when they took me to that place and they tried to make me forget, I remembered the stars. I remembered who I was. And I remembered Martin. Click. Silence. Martin looked down at Finn. You're not the first dog who saved her, he said softly. But you might be the last. Outside, the night thickened. Inside the cave, a war was forming between the past they thought they knew and the truth rising like smoke from broken memory. But one thing was certain now. This wasn't about finding a lost woman. This was about saving her mission, even if it meant losing everything else. Branches snapped ahead, 2 sets of footsteps, deliberate and too synchronized to be hikers. The cold was no longer biting. It felt calculated, controlled. Nora ducked low behind a moss-covered trunk, eyes locked on the figures approaching through the fog. They weren't hunters. They weren't rescue. They were dressed in scrub-gray tactical coats with sterile white gloves, visors tucked up. Each held a sleek medical device, one a tranquilizer gun, the other what looked like a portable neurostimulator glowing faintly blue at the core. Finn growled low and Primal crouched beside Martin. Martin raised a hand to still him, but it was too late. Finn lunged left, snapping a twig, deliberately bounding through the brush in a wide arc, drawing attention. Movement left side, one of the men shouted. Target may have animal. Prepare suppression. The dart whizzed past Finn's ribcage, a breath from puncture before he disappeared over a ridge. Subject not confirmed. Could be diversion, said the second man. Sweep the area. Martin waited for their boots to pass, heart hammering in his throat. He didn't breathe until the woods swallowed them. Only then did he turn to Nora. Her eyes were wide. They're not here for Evelyn, she whispered. They're here to erase everything. No, Martin muttered. They're here because she remembered something she shouldn't have. They reunited with Finn at the foot of a burned-out stump farther south. The dog's chest heaved, but he was unharmed. His tail beat slowly, sensing safety for now. Martin sat down against a dead tree face, pale, shaking from more than just the cold. The encounter had triggered something else. He took a deep breath, then another. Nora didn't speak. She watched him. Back in '85, Martin finally said, voice low. There was a woman, a nurse from Montana, whistleblower. She exposed a major pharmaceutical cover-up, Navexa Corporation. They were testing cognition drugs on unknowing patients. He looked up at Nora. That woman was Evelyn. Nora's jaw tensed. And you. You already knew. Martin nodded. She testified anonymously. She was almost killed before we pulled her into witness protection. You were part of that. I was the handler who closed her file. The fire in Nora's voice came fast. And you married her ever. Martin didn't flinch. It wasn't romantic. Not at first. But we rebuilt our lives together. Quietly. She made peace with hiding, or at least I thought she did. He exhaled, visibly ashamed. But now, the same people who tried to bury that story, they're still working. Just with new tech, cleaner gloves, bigger shields. Evelyn didn't just wander back into trouble. She walked in. Nora stood pacing now. She knew the injections wouldn't erase her memories. She let them use her. Martin's eyes flickered. She was always resistant to neuroblockers. The trial in '85 failed on her. It didn't make her forget, it made her remember more. Nora blinked. Wait, you're saying these new drugs? They're based on the same compounds, modified. But if her brain works the same way, then she's a reversal subject. 1 in a billion. Martin grabbed a stick, drew a line in the dirt. Everyone else forgets. Evelyn remembers. Everything. Nora pulled out the patient report again. Trial 3, E3. Evelyn was the third test subject. She might have volunteered under false pretenses, Martin murmured. She had the clearance, the background. They wouldn't have suspected her, but she must have found something bigger than before, Nora whispered. Big enough to bring them back. Martin nodded grimly. And now they're scrubbing. The words hung like frost in the air. Night crept faster in the woods. They didn't dare light a fire. They buried their scent trail, stayed downwind. Finn curled between them like a silent sentinel. And in the silence, Nora spoke again. You said you closed her file. What does that mean? Martin looked at her. It means I made Evelyn Carter officially dead in every system. She became someone else. No social, no bank, no real name. Nora swallowed. But she used her real name again. She broke the cover, Martin said softly. She wanted to be found. By them. No, by me. The woods shifted again, temperature dropping sharply as mist rose from the forest floor. Then a faint hum, a drone buzzed above, scanning with infrared. They froze. Martin pulled a thermal blanket from the satchel, wrapped it around Nora, then himself. Then Finn. Hold still, he whispered. The drone paused overhead. Searchlight flared white. It hovered, then turned and vanished into the tree line. Nora's breathing slowed. Her hand reached for Martin's. He didn't pull away. I'm sorry I didn't tell you everything, he said. She shook her head. You were trying to protect her. So was I. They sat in silence. Then, as if summoned, Nora's tablet blinked to life. Signal weak. 1 bar. Satellite bounce. A single message popped up. Evelyn Carter. Automated drop signal detected. 5.3 km at north. Coordinates embedded. Nora's hand trembled. Martin looked over. She's still transmitting. He stood, knees stiff, soul burning. Then we're still hunting. They began the trek just before dawn. Finn led, always a few paces ahead, sniffing like he had more than blood in his instincts. Martin kept scanning the trees, ears tuned for drone return, or worse, more boots. But something else gnawed at him. He remembered the last thing Evelyn ever said to him before she left for the facility. If I don't come back, don't blame yourself. Blame the silence you helped build. He'd buried that line for 3 weeks. But now it rang louder than any siren. They paused near a cluster of stone ruins, an old logging station. Nora sat on a stump, pulled out the ID tag again, the one labeled E3. She's not a patient, she murmured. She's an archive. Martin nodded. And they want to burn the archive before the world reads it. His voice darkened, but not if we burn them first. As they crossed into the northern ridge, footsteps emerged behind them, slow, precise stalking. Finn bristled. Martin raised the gun. Show yourself. A man stepped out unarmed, but with surgical calm. He wore no insignia, but his coat was spotless. I assume you're Martin Carter? Martin didn't lower his weapon. And I assume you're the one who lost Evelyn? The man's lips curled. Oh, no. She was never lost. She simply wandered out of containment. Nora stepped forward. You drugged her? You made people think she was dying. No, the man said. We gave them peace. She interrupted that. Martin snapped, by remembering the truth. The man's gaze narrowed. Truth is malleable. Memory is programmable. And people like Evelyn make that difficult. He stepped back slowly. I won't stop you. You're close enough to find her now. But ask yourself something, Mr. Carter, if she remembers everything. Will she even recognize you? Martin didn't reply. The man vanished into the trees. As dawn bled over the ridge, the snow grew deeper. But so did the conviction. They weren't chasing a ghost anymore. They were chasing the only witness left to a crime everyone else forgot. And for the first time in 40 years, Martin Carter was ready to remember everything too. The forest had turned white, not with fresh snow, but with silence so dense it rang in the bones. The kind of silence that follows a scream long since swallowed by trees. Martin trudged forward through knee-high powder, each step a labor of old muscle and fading breath. Nora followed, scanning the tree line with a hunter's focus. They were half a kilometer from the signal ping, and something about the air had changed. It was Finn who found it. He halted, nose twitching toward a large, hollowed-out cedar, ancient and weather-beaten, with bark that curled like pages. He barked once, soft and insistent. Not alarm, not fear. A call. Nora crouched beside him, peered into the opening, and gasped. Inside the tree, wrapped in a waterproof pouch, was a worn leather notebook with a red ribbon cracked at the spine. A name was scratched faintly on the cover in slanted cursive. Evelyn Carter, Trial 3. Martin's fingers trembled as he opened it. Inside, Evelyn's voice rose from the page like fog from cold earth. Day 1. They think I'm gone, that the mind's fog has taken me. I let them think it. Let them bathe me in questions. Let them watch. But I see, I remember. Nora leaned closer. Each page was meticulous, dated, observed like a case file. Evelyn had faked symptoms with chilling precision. The shakes, the stumbles, the forgotten names. All deliberate, all performed. But it wasn't just deception, it was documentation. Every dosage, every conversation, every change in behavior from patients around her. And then the mention of him. There's one. Young, charismatic, always carries a silver watch worn on the inside of his wrist. He never gives his full name, but he smells like power and guilt. Martin froze. The watch, he murmured. Nora looked at him. What? He didn't answer right away. Then he exhaled. 37 years ago, Martin began during the Montana trials. There was an intern who botched a blind test, switched vials. It nearly killed 3 subjects. 1 died. Nora stared. He vanished before the hearings. We assumed he'd been scrubbed, she whispered. You think that's him? Martin nodded grimly. He didn't vanish. He just waited long enough to come back clean. Suddenly, Finn growled. The sound was wrong, muffled. By the time they turned, it was too late. A net of weighted cords shot through the trees, slamming into Finn's flank, pulling him to the ground. He howled once, furious, terrified, before a figure in white darted from the tree line, snatched the net, and disappeared into the forest. No, Nora screamed, lunging after. Martin grabbed her arm, yanking her back before she crossed into open. Trap, he hissed. They both stared, helpless, as the last flashes of white vanished into the mist. The only thing left behind, a clump of black fur stained red. Finn's. Nora dropped to her knees, fists clenching the snow. They took him, she said through gritted teeth. They took him like he's just another specimen. Martin said nothing. He stepped forward, picked up the blood-stained fur, held it between his fingers like a relic. This isn't a message, he said quietly. Nora looked up. What is it? It's a warning. He turned face set like stone. Evelyn knew this would happen. She knew they'd escalate. He looked at the notebook again, flipped to the last page Evelyn had written. If they find out I'm remembering, they'll try to erase me for good. But if you're reading this, it means I made it far enough. Just follow the sound. I've left a voice in the trees. Martin closed the book. She knew we'd come. That night they didn't sleep. They couldn't. Martin sat staring into the dark eyes locked on the spot where Finn had last stood. His chest ached, not from exertion, but from the weight of choices that had unraveled into chaos. You okay? Nora asked softly. He didn't answer. She moved beside him, eyes rimmed with grief. I know he's just a dog, she began. But Martin shook his head hard. No, he's not. He turned to her, eyes shining. Finn's the last piece of Evelyn I had. The only one who still waited at the door for her. Who still heard her voice in every wind. He clenched the bloody fur. I lost her once. I will not lose him too. Nora's voice cracked. Then what do we do? Martin stood. We burn the map. We go blind. We listen instead. They abandoned the coordinates. They followed instinct. And instinct led them north, deeper into the old-growth forest, where GPS died and maps lied. It was there, among a cluster of snow-covered pine trunks, that Martin spotted a glint, a sliver of mirror nailed to a tree at eye level. He stepped closer. Etched faintly in the glass, she still remembers. Do you? Below it, hanging from a branch, was a crude voice recorder, sealed in plastic. Martin pressed play. Evelyn's voice crackled alive. They think they can break me again. They think time's taken my teeth. But I have more bite now than ever. And if you're hearing this, it means I bought you time, so use it. Get them. Bring the truth home. Nora's lips trembled. Martin whispered. She left a trail, one only we would follow. Just then his phone vibrated. No signal, but a Bluetooth ping. A new message appeared on screen. Vitals lost. Canine subject 009. Last pulse, 12 minutes ago. Location 400 meters east. Nora stared at him in horror. No, but Martin was already running. They reached the clearing in under 5 minutes, lungs on fire boots, shredded from thorns. And then they saw it. A circular pad scorched into the ground. Machinery dragged away, but the imprint remained. Blood on the snow. But no Finn, Nora wept. Martin knelt, and in the very center of the circle, a single dog tag. Finn's. He picked it up, fingers trembling, then stood. I'm not leaving this forest without him, he said. Or her. Nora stared at him. You're going to go after them. Martin nodded. I made a vow once. To protect the only witness who ever told the truth, even when no one believed her. I failed that vow when I told her to lie low. When I told her silence was safer. He looked into the trees. But not anymore. Nora stepped beside him. Then let's be loud. They gathered the last of their gear. Loaded the remaining tranquilizer darts from the old emergency kit Martin had buried years ago during his FBI days. Martin checked his sidearm, not for intimidation. For war, he turned to Nora. You can go back. You've done enough. But she didn't budge. She raised Evelyn's notebook gripped tight in both hands. She's my blood too, Nora said, and Finn's mine now. Martin looked at her and nodded. Together they stepped into the white. No map, no beacon, only memory and rage. The map led them nowhere, but the wind, it whispered. The trees had thinned just enough to reveal a clearing. No satellite had marked, no ranger had claimed. And in the middle of that nothingness stood a one-story prefab metal structure camouflaged in green tarp and forest dust. No sign, no path, just a fading red cross on its side, half scraped, half forgotten. A rescue station at first glance, but Martin knew better. He held out a hand, stopping Nora before she stepped into the clearing. Finn was gone, Evelyn too. But instinct sharpened where grief bled. Observe before you enter, he muttered. Nora crouched beside him. What is this place? Martin didn't answer. His breath clouded the air. He scanned the trees. Cameras small, black, motionless. Fake branches with antenna tips. A single solar panel hidden beneath dead pine needles. They built it to disappear, he said, then added, but someone's still here. They moved like shadows, Nora, at Martin's heel. The front door was slightly ajar. Not broken, not abandoned. Just waiting. Inside, metal tables. White light. Cabinets labeled with red tape. A chemical smell masked with pine disinfectant. It was clean. Too clean. And on the far wall, rows of filing drawers, each labeled with patient numbers and state initials. Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana. Martin opened one. Inside, photos of elderly men and women. Medical reports. Annotations in code. Words like Phase 2, compliant, and cognitive reset, successful. Nora froze, reading a name tag, Amelia Thorne. She was in the same wing as Evelyn, she whispered. They said she died in her sleep. Martin found her file. No cause of death. Only transferred. Cycle completed. They pushed deeper into the structure, past the sterile halls into a darkened room lit only by the blue flicker of a single screen. It was playing a video. A woman tied to a chair, wrists strapped, head restrained by a padded vise. It was Evelyn, but she wasn't broken. Her eyes sharp, voice controlled. You think because I'm old I'm done? I worked the war wings in '66. I've seen bodies opened before anesthesia. You think I don't recognize fear behind your surgical gloves? I remember everything. You erased the wrong parts. You picked the wrong nurse to silence. Martin stumbled forward, knees buckling. Nora tried to steady him, but he reached toward the screen hand, trembling. Evelyn? She was older, yes. Thinner, but her fire was intact. Even strapped down, she burned. The screen cut to black, then static. And a moment later, another voice. Male, calm, clinical. Trial 3 exhibits. Resilience beyond projection. Begin escalation. If resistance persists, initiate reset protocol with Subject 0. Martin stepped back. Subject 0. His eyes widened. No. He ran to the next door, threw it open. Inside a medical bay. One bed, one IV stand, one metal cart of syringes. Empty. But on the counter, an old framed photo flipped face down. Martin turned it over. His breath caught. It was a photo of him and her, his first wife. The one he buried 22 years ago. Footsteps. Behind him. He turned and dropped the frame. There she stood. Isabel, her hair longer streaked with gray. Her face older but unchanged. Same lips, same eyes. Same ghost from the grave. Hello, Martin, she said softly. His mouth moved, but no sound came. Nora stood frozen behind him. Isabel stepped forward, lab coat brushing her knees. I told them you'd find your way here. You always do when you care too much. Martin stumbled back, hitting the IV pole. You died. I disappeared, she corrected. Her voice had no malice, just the resignation of someone who'd practiced this moment 1,000 times. You staged your death, he rasped. She nodded. For the program. For what we believed. But you walked away. I didn't. Nora reached for her pocket. Isabel's eyes darted there. Don't, she said. Calm, final. 2 guards stepped into the room behind her. Unarmed, but ready. Martin stepped in front of Nora. You're behind this? His voice cracked. Isabel exhaled. I'm a part of it, not the architect. She looked at him with something like pity. It started with memory care, Martin. You remember that? We wanted to preserve the mind, not strip it. Martin shook his head. You experimented on the most vulnerable. You erased their families. Isabel's face didn't change. We gave them peace. No trauma, no fear, just quiet endings. By lying, Nora snapped. Isabel turned to her. By rewriting what pain left behind. Martin's hand shot out too slow. A dart hit his neck. He staggered. Nora screamed. Isabel's voice rang out, "Don't hurt her." But Martin was already down, clutching his throat. Why he choked? Why now? Isabel kneeled beside him, tears in her eyes. "You came too close," she whispered. "I needed you to forget, like they did." Martin's vision blurred. Evelyn's voice echoed in his mind. "They'll try to erase me. But if you remember me, I'm still alive." And then, darkness. When Martin awoke, he was restrained. Same padded chair, same vice on the head. But the room was colder. Isabel stood beside the console, a needle in hand. He whispered, barely conscious, "You think memory is weakness? But it's the only thing that ever made me strong." She hesitated, and in that hesitation, the door burst open. Smoke, light, a shriek. Nora, holding a flare gun, Finn at her side, wounded, limping, but alive. He was drowning in memory. No sound. Just the throb of blood behind his eyes. And a face, her face lit by the glow of old desk lamps years ago behind layers of documents labeled classified. Evelyn had been standing then, back straight, voice trembling only slightly. "They're testing on the memory-impaired Martin. They're not treating Alzheimer's. They're manipulating the perception of time, of reality." And Martin, back then, younger, cleaner, more afraid of exposure than the truth, had told her to stop. "Evelyn, if you keep going, I can't protect you anymore." And she had smiled. "Then don't. Just don't forget me." Martin gasped awake. No chair, no restraints. But his wrists were bruised, and the taste of metal filled his mouth. Flashes of memory, real or planted, raced through him like blades. He wasn't sure anymore. The line between what he chose to forget and what had been taken from him, it was vanishing. He tried to sit up only to realize he wasn't alone. Nora was gone. But Isabel stood at the door, silhouetted against the white fluorescence. Her voice was soft, almost maternal. "I gave you a chance to forget Martin. Why did you resist?" He couldn't answer. Elsewhere in the facility, Nora moved like fire. Her eyes scanned every hallway, every corner. No guards, not anymore. They had moved their attention to Martin. A calculated mistake. In her hand, a drive she'd stolen from Isabel's terminal, encrypted. But it wasn't just data. It was location pings. One of them flickered. Active. Finn. The coordinates pulsed like a heartbeat. Underground, Sector D3. She followed it. Inside his locked enclosure, Finn lay motionless until he heard it. A faint humming. A cooling fan inside a power panel. He crawled, nose twitching, ears alert. Then wires. Old ones. Exposed at the base of a cabinet. Weak voltage, but enough. He bit gently, carefully. Sparks. Not enough to harm. Just enough to fry the silent alarm. And with it, every light in the hallway blinked red. Sirens didn't scream. They hissed, mechanical and slow. But they were loud enough for Nora. She picked up her pace, eyes burning. Martin was still on the floor when Isabel stepped closer, a syringe in her hand. He didn't flinch. She spoke as if reciting a lullaby. "Do you remember what you told me in 1985? You said, 'The world doesn't need the truth. It needs control.'" Martin looked up. "That was before I met Evelyn." Her fingers hesitated. The syringe lowered. "I loved you, Martin," she said. "I still do." He didn't blink. "Then why erase me?" She knelt down beside him. "Because you stopped believing in the cause." He looked past her, his voice barely audible. "I started believing in people instead." Meanwhile, Nora reached D3. A narrow door, biometric lock. She didn't hesitate. Pulled the stolen badge, slammed it on the scanner. Green light, click. Inside cages, rows of them. Not for animals. Beds, IVs. Elderly men and women sleeping with eyes open. And in the last cage, Finn, wounded, alert. He lifted his head. Their eyes met. She rushed forward, tears blurring her sight. "Hey, hero," she whispered. She pulled the latch. Finn staggered out, tongue lolling, tail thudding, once weak, but alive. She buried her face into his neck, then froze. On the wall behind him, a screen. Live feed. Martin, Isabel. Syringe. 1 minute from decision. She ran, dragging Finn. Hallways flickered. Electricity pulsed in angry waves. Overhead voices shouted. Orders scrambled. She didn't care. She would burn it all. For Evelyn. For her grandfather. For herself. Back in the lab, Isabel pressed the syringe against Martin's neck. "Final dose," she whispered. His eyes locked on hers. "You're going to bury this forever." Her lips trembled. He asked the last question he ever would. "What happens to Evelyn?" Isabel whispered, "She remembers too much. She can't come back." And then gently Martin closed his eyes and said, "Then neither can I." He moved fast. Too fast for 77. Elbow to her wrist. The syringe flew. He tackled her to the ground. In a flash, he had it in his own hand. Isabel screamed, "Don't!" But Martin drove the needle into his own arm. The drug hissed under his skin. Seconds. A lifetime. He collapsed beside her. Nora arrived seconds too late. She saw her grandfather crumpled on the floor, body twitching. Isabel sobbing beside him, Finn growling low. But Nora didn't scream. She walked in, calm, pulled out the flare gun, aimed it directly at the main console. "Back up the footage," she said, "or I fire." Isabel looked up, mascara running. "It's too late." He made a choice. Nora stepped closer. "Then I'm making mine." She fired. The flare hit the servers. Fire, sparks, smoke. Alarms wailed. Water sprayed. Martin, barely conscious, looked up, eyes unfocused, lips forming one last word. "Run!" And Nora ran, dragging Finn. Through smoke, fire, sirens, outside into the snow, where the world was quiet again, where no one knew what had just happened. But she did, and she remembered. The snow came sideways like ash from a fire the sky couldn't extinguish. Nora's breath was sharp, chest-burning. Finn led the way through the twisting pines, his nose low to the ground, ears flicking at every distant crack. They were a storm wrapped in silence, wind trees, and one name pulsing in her mind like a prayer. Evelyn. The cabin emerged like a bruise on white skin, low, squat, and windowless. A generator hummed faintly behind it, and one dim light pulsed above the entrance, flickering against the falling snow. Nora crouched behind a snowbank, whispering, "Finn." The dog didn't wait. He darted through the tree line, vanishing into the fog like a black whisper. Seconds later, a crash, barking, snarling, a man's voice screaming in panic. She ran, inside chaos. A guard flailed near the back door, trying to ward off Finn's fury. Blood stained his glove. He screamed again, and Finn, graceful and brutal, launched for his throat. Nora slipped past him. A long hallway, a steel door left ajar, and beyond it, her. Evelyn sat in a metal chair, wrists bound, head low. Her white hair hung like soaked threads. "Evelyn!" Nora cried, rushing to her. Evelyn stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open. Her voice, thin, raspy, cut through the noise like a blade. "Cháu là đứa bé mà chúng ta từng cứu, năm 2009. Nora froze. Everything inside her stilled. What did you say?" Evelyn coughed. Blood at the corner of her lips. "Cháu không nhớ sao, một căn nhà, dưới lòng đất." Những tiếng hét. And suddenly she did. The images hit like a sledgehammer. A damp cellar, metal stairs, voices arguing in the dark, a flashlight beam hitting a girl's face, and then arms. Safe arms. A woman whispering, "You're safe now." A man holding her close, whispering her name over and over. Not her birth name. The name they gave her when they took her in. Nora. Nora dropped to her knees. Hands trembling, she cut through Evelyn's restraints. "I didn't remember. Until now." Evelyn managed to smile. "They made sure you wouldn't. That was the point." Nora pulled her up. "We're going home." But Evelyn shook her head. "No, you have to stop them first." Outside, Finn growled. More voices. Footsteps. Evelyn clutched Nora's wrist, eyes burning. "Martin, is he alive?" Before Nora could answer. Gunfire. Finn barked once, sharp, urgent, and took off into the snow again. Nora helped Evelyn down the hallway. The exit was close. Meanwhile, at the edge of the woods, a tall figure waited. Martin, one hand pressed to his side where blood soaked into his coat. He leaned against a pine, eyes fixed on the path ahead. He heard the voices. The boots crunching in snow, the hum of the incoming storm. And then him, the man in the lab coat. Younger than Martin, but not young. A face that smiled without joy. A watch on his wrist, worn backwards. "Dr. Caleb Monroe Martin," said softly. The man raised an eyebrow. "I wondered if you'd show up, old man." Martin stepped forward, pain forgotten. "I should have buried you in 1985. Dr. Monroe chuckled. "You did. Or tried. But you and your precious wife didn't realize truth doesn't bury that easily." Martin didn't blink. Neither does justice. And they charged. The fight wasn't clean. Martin was older, slower. But he fought like a man who knew this was his last chance to make anything right. Caleb fought like a man who had everything to lose. Snow exploded around them as they grappled, elbows, fists, knees. Martin took a punch to the face, staggered back, and Caleb drew a syringe. "You forget, Martin. That's what I do best." But before he could strike, Finn, out of the fog, like a shadow with teeth, he lunged. Caleb screamed as the syringe fell from his hand. Martin tackled him again. The snow turned red. Nora and Evelyn burst from the cabin just in time to see Martin and Caleb struggling in the open field. She screamed, "Grandpa!" Martin looked up just long enough for Caleb to stab him with a shard of metal from the broken syringe. Martin collapsed. Caleb rose, panting bloodied, and looked at Nora with a grin. "You're just like your mother, loud and useless." Evelyn stepped forward, defiant. "She's not useless. She remembers." Caleb turned toward her, only to be taken down again by Finn. This time the dog didn't let go. Martin on the ground fumbled in his coat pocket. He pulled out a small device, a steel disc no larger than a coin. He pressed a button. It blinked once, then again. A satellite ping activated, and miles above them, in low orbit, a silent alert screamed across secure networks. Martin smiled, blood in his teeth. "Now they'll see." Nora reached him. She fell to her knees. No, Grandpa." Martin looked up, eyes soft. "Nora," he whispered. She leaned in. "I remember." He smiled and closed his eyes. Behind them, Evelyn stood tall despite her injuries. Finn limped back to her side. Snow fell in slow, deliberate flakes. Sirens wailed in the distance, and the wind carried Martin's last breath into the trees. The snow hadn't stopped falling. The world was silent in that way only a snowy forest could be. Thick white blanketed the pines, muffled every sound, and turned the scene of violence into something eerily serene. But it was not quiet inside Evelyn Carter. She knelt beside Martin's body, fingers trembling as they pressed against the pulse point in his neck. Nothing. Her breath hitched, teeth clenched, as the last warmth of his chest faded beneath her palm. His eyes were still slightly open, like he hadn't finished saying what he needed to say. "Martin?" Her whisper cracked. Finn whined low beside her body, curled protectively around Martin's legs, his side heaving with exhaustion and wounds. His fur was matted with blood, not just his own. Snowflakes caught in his lashes like ashes from a fire long burned out. Evelyn's hand clenched. She pulled out the last page from the journal hidden in her coat. The page Martin had slipped her days ago, when they first found each other again, not in joy but in war. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. "Don't let the truth die with me." Evelyn folded the paper slowly, as if to press those words deeper into her bones. Then she screamed. It wasn't a scream of panic, it was command. A warning to the forest that she was still here, that he was gone, that someone would pay. Finn raised his head. From the ridge behind them, through the gray veil of snow, Nora stumbled into view. Her face was streaked with tears frozen to her cheeks, her hands scratched and red from climbing through thorns and ice. Her eyes locked on Evelyn, and then on Martin's body, and something inside her cracked. "No!" She dropped to her knees, arms wrapping around Evelyn, breath tearing from her throat in sobs too raw to be called words. But Evelyn didn't sob. She shook once like a shiver running through steel. Then she stood. "Take the journal," she said, voice low. "And the hard drive. It's all in his pack." Nora's hands trembled as she reached for the backpack. It was half buried in snow, spattered with blood, but intact. Inside the drives, the documents, the map with Evelyn's penciled notes, all sealed in waterproof plastic. Suddenly, Finn let out a low growl. Evelyn turned. A figure was standing just inside the tree line, watching. The doctor, the man who had orchestrated it all, whose hands had touched every file, every needle. He didn't speak, just stared. Evelyn stepped forward slowly, like approaching a wounded animal or a demon. Nora moved to stop her, but Evelyn raised a hand. "No," she said softly. "This ends with me." She walked toward him. Her boots crunched on the snow. No weapon in her hand, only the blood of her husband still wet on her fingers. "You came to finish the job?" she asked. He tilted his head. "I came to see if you'd die here quietly." Her laugh was bitter. "You don't know quiet. You've been running noise through veins for decades. Synthetic silences, manufactured forgetting. You think you can just erase people? You're not people anymore," he said. "You're a liability." "Wrong," Evelyn whispered. She drew from her coat a small transmitter Martin's beacon, a memory. The light blinked blue once then again. "You think that little trick will save you?" he hissed. "No," she said, "but it'll bury you." In the distance, faintly sirens. Then the doctor ran, and Finn chased. The dog's bark echoed through the forest, like a battle cry, low and guttural. Trees blurred as Finn surged forward, injured, but relentless. Nora followed behind, slower, gripping the journal tight to her chest. Evelyn didn't move. She stared at the path through the woods where the doctor had vanished and where Martin had once told her. Sometimes the monsters aren't in the dark. Sometimes they wear white coats. Where? She turned back toward the body. Martin's face was pale now. The red pooling under him had darkened, freezing in the cold. She knelt again, brushing away snow from his cheek, smoothing his hair like it was 30 years ago. And they were in a hospital room, exhausted, but young. "You did it," she whispered. "You kept the promise." From the trees came a high, sharp yelp, then a thud. Silence. Nora returned, eyes wide. "He's gone," she said. Finn ran him off the ledge. I think he's hurt." Together they climbed toward the ledge rocks, jagged, snow-stained, and there, halfway down, Finn lay bleeding. His side was heaving, but he lifted his head when he saw them, and wagged his tail. They scaled the slope with aching limbs and frozen fingers. Nora reached Finn first, wrapping her arms around him carefully. Evelyn checked the gash along his ribs, deep but not fatal. She whispered to him, her voice soft like a lullaby for warriors. "You found her," she said. "You saved us." Finn licked her hand weakly. Above them, a helicopter's rotor blades thundered through the trees. The signal had worked. The world was coming. But Evelyn knew it wasn't over. Nora asked, "Will they believe us?" Evelyn looked at her. "They'll try not to. But they'll have to." Back at Martin's body, officers gathered. Crime scene tape in the snow, bright yellow against white. A body bag. camera flashes, and through it all, Evelyn stood tall, her back straight, her eyes locked on the horizon. One of the agents approached. "Are you Mrs. Carter?" "No," she said. "I was. But today, I'm the one who remembers." She handed him the journal, the drive, and Martin's badge. He took them without a word, and slowly the snow began to fall again. But this time it wasn't quiet. It was filled with the sound of truth. Hours passed. The snowstorm broke by midday, and the officers set up tents, portable heaters, satellite relays. The media was kept at bay for now, but Evelyn knew their faces would be everywhere by morning. The last whistleblower, the surviving witness, the girl who was once lost, and the man who gave everything to remember. Nora sat on a log near the fire, wrapped in a thermal blanket, staring into the flames. She hadn't spoken since the body was flown away. Her hand still clutched the dog tag they found in Martin's coat. E3, not to be released. Evelyn joined her. "You were 5 when we found you," she said gently. "You were locked in that clinic outside Eugene. They said you had no name, no parents." "I remember the light," Nora whispered. "It buzzed all night. I was so cold." Evelyn placed an arm around her. "Martin was the one who carried you out. He never forgave himself for not finding the others." Nora turned. "Were there others?" Evelyn didn't answer. Instead, she looked toward the fire. Some of them might still be out there, hiding, or trapped, or erased. Nora's eyes sharpened. "Then we find them." Evelyn nodded. "Yes, we find them." By the time night fell again, the forest had changed. Once it had been a place of secrets, of burial grounds, and broken mines. Now, it was a place of awakening. The truth had bled into the snow, stained it, marked it. It could never be white again. Nora sat with Finn curled beside her, his body wrapped in a heating blanket. A vet team had stabilized him. He would survive. He was already sleeping, ears twitching, paws moving in dreams. Evelyn stood near the edge of the woods, watching headlights in the distance, as more vehicles arrived. Her fingers were wrapped around Martin's old lighter, the one he used to light the fireplace, where the letter had first appeared. She flicked it open. The flame danced. "Do you think he knew it would end this way?" Nora asked. Evelyn smiled softly. He hoped it wouldn't, but he prepared like it would. They both stood in silence. Then Nora said, "So what now?" Evelyn stared at the flame. "Now we publish everything. The footage, the files, the journal. Names, dates, faces. You think it'll change anything?" "It'll start something," Evelyn replied. "That's all it needs to do." Then she dropped the lighter into the snow. The flame hissed and vanished, but the warmth it left lingered in their bones. They walked back to the tents together, not speaking, just listening. The crackle of radios, the low hum of generators, the occasional bark of Finn dreaming of white fields and dark coats. Somewhere nearby, a medic laughed, brief, tired human. Evelyn unzipped a sleeping bag and settled in beside Finn. Her fingers brushed his collar now, engraved with a name and badge number. He wasn't just a dog. He was part of the story. Nora sat across from her knees, drawn to her chest. She watched Evelyn closely, as if afraid that the woman might vanish like all the others. But Evelyn didn't. She leaned back, closed her eyes, and whispered one last sentence into the cold night. Truth leaves footprints even in snow. And the camera, one of the body cams still recording, caught it all. Later, when the footage was released to the world, that was the image that stayed. An old woman scarred and strong. A girl once forgotten, now fierce. And a dog lying between them like a guardian of memory. Not heroes, just survivors who chose not to forget. The snow continued to fall that night, but no one feared it anymore. Because now they knew what was beneath. Not just secrets, but love and pain and memory and the cost of keeping quiet. In the morning, the sky cleared, and as the sun rose, it cast golden light on the blood-stained snow now frozen into history. A scar, but also a beginning. 3 weeks later, a large auditorium buzzed with murmurs. The Oregon State Medical Ethics Conference had never hosted such a crowd. Not for bureaucrats, not for doctors. But tonight, they came for a girl with fire in her voice and scars behind her eyes. Nora Carter stood alone on stage, the spotlight tracing the outline of a story no one else had lived. Behind her, projected large across a digital screen, were names. Dozens of them. Former patients, victims, whistleblowers, survivors. She stepped up to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and began. "My name is Nora Carter. I am not a scientist. I'm not a doctor. I'm someone who survived because 2 people who were never supposed to meet again chose to remember." A pause. The room was still. "I lost my mother when I was 5. At least that's what they told me. I don't remember her face. I remember being cold. I remember being strapped to a bed. I remember a buzzing light above me that never turned off. Her voice didn't shake, not once, but I also remember his eyes, my grandfather's. The way they looked at me when he found me in the woods. Not like a burden, not like a ghost, like a second chance. She clicked the remote in her hand. A new slide. Evelyn's photograph. The signature on the testimony released nationwide. The woman who died only days earlier in her sleep with her hand resting on a journal titled "Memory is Proof." Nora looked at the screen and then back to the crowd. She pretended to forget, to help others remember. She let them think she was broken so she could trace the cracks in their system. And when they pushed too far, when they tried to erase her, another slide. A frame from the hidden footage of Evelyn's interrogation. She fought back, with memory, with words, with silence that wasn't surrender, it was strategy. The audience didn't move. I'm not here to mourn. I'm here to testify. Evelyn Carter wasn't just my grandmother. She was a frontline fighter in a war no one believed was being fought. She and my grandfather dismantled a machine built on stolen memories, on stolen lives. And they did it knowing it might cost everything. Nora's voice lowered, and it did. She stepped away from the podium, took a slow breath, and turned as a handler wheeled in a calm, regal presence. Finn, now older, his fur dusted with gray. Finn wore a blue therapy vest embroidered with gold letters, PTSD Companion, certified. He walked slowly but deliberately to the edge of the stage and sat beside Nora, pressing his body gently into her leg. He doesn't bark as much anymore, she said. But he always knows who needs him. She crouched and placed her hand on his head. He's been with patients who don't remember their names, with veterans who wake up screaming, with children who lost their words, but not their fear. Her eyes returned to the audience. He doesn't need them to speak. He just listens, like Martin did, like Evelyn did. From the back of the auditorium, someone coughed, but no one dared interrupt. Nora walked to center stage again. Her voice was soft now, but unwavering. I was born twice. Once into a world that didn't want me, and again into a family that remembered what it meant to fight. She took out a folded piece of paper, yellowed frayed at the edges. This is the last letter my grandfather ever wrote. He never sent it. I found it in his coat pocket the day after the snow melted. She opened it. I'm sorry I wasn't stronger sooner. But I see you now. I see you clearer than ever. Evelyn, you were never crazy. You were never alone. And if this ends here, let it end with truth. Let them know you mattered. Silence. I read this not just for her, but for every voice that was muted in the name of convenience. For every patient given a number instead of a name. For every caregiver who dared to care too much. Nora folded the letter and tucked it into her jacket. The screen behind her faded to black. Only her silhouette remained. And Finn's. Then she said the words that closed it all. Sometimes the only light in the forest is the memory they tried to bury. And sometimes that memory becomes a torch. A pause. And we become the ones who carry it forward. The crowd stood. Not all at once, not out of obligation, but like a tide rising slowly to shore. A journalist wept in the second row. A nurse placed a hand over her heart. A doctor dropped his pen. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again. Soft, slow, unbothered by history. But inside, something had shifted. Nora stepped down from the stage. She did not bow. She did not linger. She walked past rows of people who made way, not because she asked, but because they understood. Finn followed silent but watchful. At the back of the hall, Nora stopped and turned. If you ever cared for someone who forgot who they were, remember this, she said. The truth doesn't need perfect memory. It just needs one person brave enough to say, I saw it. Then she left. Behind her on a small table by the door lay the restored journal of Evelyn Carter. A plaque beneath it read, For those who remember. For those who fought to. The final page of the journal had one sentence in Evelyn's handwriting. Memory is not a weakness. It is resistance. And beneath that in ink, not yet faded MC. Weeks passed. Nora received letters, some from families who'd once questioned the disappearances of their loved ones. Others from former employees who had turned a blind eye, now seeking redemption. She replied to each one, not because she had answers, but because she understood what silence did. In her small apartment above the bookstore, Nora began to compile everything. Newspaper clippings, testimonies, transcripts. She called it The Forest Doesn't Forget. Every night, Finn would curl beside her feet, and she'd read a passage from Evelyn's journal aloud. She didn't need to, but it felt like keeping a promise. One entry in particular stayed with her. They want us to believe forgetting is peace, but forgetting is erasure. I will remember, even if no one else does, because memory isn't just mine. It belongs to every voice that cannot scream, every soul that cannot rest. Nora printed that entry and pinned it above her desk. Some nights, she still heard the wind in the trees. It no longer sounded like fear. It sounded like her grandparents walking beside her, still whispering, still watching, still remembering. On the 5th anniversary of Martin's death, Nora returned to the place where it had all ended. The snow was gentle this time, the air still as if the forest itself was listening. She placed a new plaque beneath the tree where he died. It read, "Martin Carter." He remembered when no one else dared to. Then she stood, took a deep breath, and spoke into the wind. "You once told me memory is resistance," she said. "I believe you now." She reached into her coat and pulled out a new journal. Empty. Waiting. She sat down on the same rock where she once found Evelyn's words, and she began to write, not to preserve the past, but to arm the future, because the world had changed. But forgetting always waited. And Nora Carter had learned the one truth that mattered most. You cannot kill a story when someone's still willing to tell it. So she told it, again and again, until the trees remembered too. The wind carried a chill that morning, whispering through the Oregon pines, like it remembered. Nora stepped slowly onto the moss-covered path leading to the ridge, her boots sinking slightly into the soft, damp ground. In her arms, she held a folded American flag, the kind handed out at military funerals, but this one hadn't come from the government. She had sewn it herself. Quietly, alone, Finn walked beside her, his movements slow and almost reverent. He didn't bark. He didn't stray. He knew where they were going. The clearing came into view, a small circle of silence in the forest's vast breadth. At its center stood a newly carved stone monument, simple and gray. No grand plinth, no golden name etched for crowds to admire. Just a clean surface with a single line engraved in weathered serif, the man who chose love over silence. No name, no dates, because truth doesn't always need identity to endure. Nora stepped closer. She knelt, brushing pine needles away from the base of the stone. Her fingers trembled as she laid the old FBI badge gently on the earth. It caught the light briefly, one last glint of duty in a world that had so often perverted it. From her coat pocket, she retrieved a torn piece of red wool. Evelyn's sweater. The same one she wore when she disappeared. The same one found tangled in a fence post near the cabin months later, torn, but unmistakably hers. Nora placed it next to the badge. Then she sat beside Finn and closed her eyes. Memories vivid and brutal rolled through her like fog. The scream Evelyn never let out. Martin's last breath caught in the cold. The sound of gunfire muffled by trees. And the moment Finn leapt toward the needle meant for her. It all came crashing again. But this time it didn't drown her, because beside the grief was something steadier purpose. Evelyn had died peacefully 2 weeks after the tribunal declared her evidence legitimate and publicly condemned the private medical syndicate she had fought to expose. She didn't live to see the arrests, or the public apology. But Nora had whispered it in her ear the night she passed. "They know now, Evelyn," she'd said. "They finally believe you." A gust of wind blew through the clearing, kicking up dust and memory. Nora opened her eyes. "This isn't a grave," she said softly, running her hand along the stone. "It's a beginning." She turned to Finn. "You ready?" The dog tilted his head, then nudged the badge once, before sitting back watching the trees sway. That night, back in her cabin, Nora lit a fire in the hearth and sat by the window. In the flickering light, she pulled out a battered notebook. On the first page, she wrote 5 words. He remembered when no one did. And then she began to write. That night, as the fire dwindled to embers, Nora stood on the porch, mug of tea in her hands, eyes scanning the dark tree line. She wasn't waiting for anything in particular, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the forest still had things left to say. Finn lay curled at her feet, his breathing slow and even. A breeze rustled through the branches above, sending a small cascade of needles to the ground. One landed on her shoulder, light as breath. She didn't brush it away. In the distance, an owl hooted. Then silence again. But it wasn't empty anymore. There was presence in it. Weight. The kind of silence that comes not from absence, but completion. Nora leaned against the railing, tracing the rim of her mug with her thumb. She thought of the generations that had come before the truths buried, and unearthed the people who dared to dig where others looked away. And she made a promise. "I'll keep telling it," she said softly into the dark. "Even if they try to silence me. Even if no one listens." She looked down at Finn. "We owe them that much, don't we?" His eyes met hers. He didn't bark, didn't move, but she knew. Tomorrow she would return to the city. There were hearings to testify at. New documents to review. Other survivors who needed her voice not as a victim, but as a witness. But tonight belonged here, to Evelyn, to Martin, to all those whose names would never be carved in marble, but whose love had etched itself permanently in the bones of those who lived on. And when she finally turned and stepped back inside, she left the door open a moment longer, just in case something followed her in. Something like memory or forgiveness. The forest was quiet again, softened by morning mist, the trees still heavy with the weight of all they'd witnessed. Out of the fog, a small figure emerged, a child no older than 6, clothes torn, cheeks streaked with dirt and tears. The child looked lost, hollow-eyed, until a gentle nudge came from the side. Finn, the black-furred dog, padded beside the child, tail low and calm, his presence like a living lantern in the fog. He didn't push, just stayed close, guiding the child's steps like a memory remembered just in time. The forest, which once swallowed secrets whole, now gave something back. From a distance, a drone's soft hum marked the arrival of a search team. But the child had already crossed the threshold of trees, hand resting on Finn's back. The dog led them into the light. Miles away, Nora stood in a large glass hallway of a new facility, sleek, warm, alive, with quiet energy. Above the doors read E3 Light Center for Memory Connection and Recovery, named after Evelyn. After the number burned into her identity, reclaimed, now transformed into something that gave, rather than erased. Inside, the center felt nothing like a hospital. No beeping monitors, no white walls. It was color. Sunlight pouring through skylights. Soft music. Rooms where children painted side by side with elderly patients. A dog resting its chin in someone's lap. A girl teaching an older man to hold a crayon again. And Finn was there too, moving silently through it all, like a ghost that had chosen to stay. Not to haunt, but to hold. One room was dimmer, set apart. Designed for what they called shadow therapy, where survivors could sit without speaking. Where silence was sacred, and the only light came from a shifting wall of projections, photos, drawings, glimmers of memory. Some of them distorted, but true enough to heal. Nora walked the corridors, slowly touching a photo on the wall. Evelyn laughing, arms full of books. Another image, Martin in uniform, eyes serious but kind. She stopped before a group of visitors, teenagers with wristbands and guarded faces, led by a volunteer. They looked at her, some curious, some skeptical, and she began to speak. But not as a lecture, as a story. A long time ago, she said, a man sat in front of a fire and found a letter that changed everything. Her voice dropped and the room leaned in. Outside, Finn paused beside a window. The child he'd rescued now sat with an art therapist, painting loops of light. The camera slowly pulled back from Nora's face, from the center, from the woods beyond. And Nora's voice returned soft, steady. Not everyone lost in the forest wants to be found. But those who love in the dark deserve to be remembered. Cut to black. Then a faint flare like a fire rekindled. One final line appeared on the screen. To those who carry memory like flame, burn bright, and never alone. The E3 Light Center had once been an abandoned schoolhouse. Nora and a small team of survivors, turned whistleblowers, spent months repurposing the building, stripping it of its institutional past and rewriting its walls with intention. No barcodes, no locked doors, no silence that wasn't chosen. Each hallway held fragments of stories, murals made by children, memory boards for patients, and an entire wing dedicated to the room that remembers. In it, they placed artifacts. Evelyn's medical tag, the syringe casing Nora found in the snow, a replica of the fireplace log that had hidden her letter. The room had no placards, no names, only whispers. Visitors walked barefoot on heated wooden floors, the space dimmed to twilight. A motion sensor gently lit up objects as people passed. One patient, a woman in her 90s, reached out toward the glowing replica of the letter. She began to cry. It was not sadness. It was recognition. Across the center, Nora maintained a simple routine. Mornings began with tea in the garden, where lavender and rosemary bushes bloomed wild. Midday brought a group circle, not for talking, but drawing. Stories that couldn't yet be said aloud found life in color line and shadow. At night, when most lights dimmed, she walked Finn around the perimeter. The old dog still carried a slight limp from the injury he sustained during the rescue, but he walked proudly, his head high, always glancing back to make sure she was there. One evening, Nora entered a room to find a young boy curled up on the rug, staring at the flickering shadows on the wall. "Do you remember your family?" he asked without turning. Nora sat beside him. "Sometimes. But some of them I never really knew." The boy nodded. "That's okay. I think the dog remembers for you." Finn curled near the door, opened one eye. Nora smiled. Maybe he did. Later, Nora would write that moment down in a worn notebook she kept locked in a drawer. She titled the page, "Memory by Proxy." At the back of the facility, there was a bench built from the wood of the same tree that once held Evelyn's journal. On sunny days, Nora would sit there alone and read aloud from transcripts of whistleblower testimony, not for any audience, just so the trees could hear. She believed they remembered too. One day, as the seasons shifted to fall, she received a letter, handwritten, sealed in an old envelope. No return address. Inside was a photo of her aged 4. Taken the day Evelyn and Martin had found her in the woods. Clutched in her tiny hands was a branch shaped like a heart. On the back, one line, "You were always meant to find your way back here." Tears came quick. She showed the photo to Finn. He tilted his head, sniffed it, and gave a soft whine. Maybe he remembered that day, too. That winter, the snow fell early. It blanketed the roof of the E3 Light Center, softened the sound of doors closing, and made the morning sun bounce off every window like the whole building was glowing from within. Nora stood by the statue near the forest's edge. It still bore no name, no date, just those words, the one who chose love over silence. She brushed fresh snow off the surface, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded paper. Martin's original badge clearance, long expired. She tucked it into a seam in the stone behind a small notch only she and Evelyn had ever known about. A quiet offering. From behind her, children laughed. A group of patients and therapists were building shapes in the snow. Not snowmen, but animals. One girl built a fox. A man with trembling hands shaped something that looked like a dog, awkward but determined. Finn trotted over, circled it, and gently laid down beside the sculpture. Nora sat down beside him. Her breath fogged the air. "You're not just a survivor," she whispered to the dog, to the forest, to herself. "You're a keeper." And then, like a whisper, from somewhere far off, maybe from the part of her that still remembered Evelyn's voice, she heard the words, "Not everyone gets out of the woods, but those who do must carry light." She stood, turned toward the building, and walked forward. Inside, a new group had just arrived. Among them, a mother and son. The woman's eyes haunted the child's gaze, too old for his age. Nora met them at the threshold. "Welcome," she said. "You're not alone anymore." And with that, the doors closed gently behind them. Outside, the snow continued to fall silent, soft and steady. The light inside never flickered. Weeks later, Nora stood at a podium again, this time, not in a conference hall, but under the sky, an outdoor gathering. Survivors, families, reporters, children who had drawn pictures of Finn in watercolor, taped them to a long board beside the stone marker. She didn't read from paper. She didn't need to. My grandmother once told me, she began, that the mind is not just where we store memories. It's where we choose which ones to live by. The wind lifted her hair, cold but gentle. I was a child they tried to erase. A page in a file marked inconvenient. But Evelyn and Martin refused to let silence become my ending. Her voice trembled not from fear, but from the weight of having survived. "I tell this story not so you'll remember them, but so you'll remember what they stood against, what they fought for, what they saved." She stepped down, walked straight to Finn, now gray around the muzzle. He leaned his head into her chest. They stood still. A reporter approached. "Do you believe justice was done?" they asked. Nora looked toward the forest. "I believe truth is still walking," she said. "And it never walks alone." She turned, hand resting on Finn's back, and walked down the path again, the same one Evelyn once walked, carrying a child. Now it was her turn. To carry light, to remember aloud, and to never let the dark be louder than the love they left behind. Later that night, Nora sat by the fire with a journal open in her lap. She wrote, "We do not inherit silence, we break it. We do not forget by force, we remember by choice. And memory, when shared, becomes resistance." She closed the book, kissed Finn on the head, and whispered the final words Evelyn ever said. "Don't let them take it." Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the flames danced, steady, stubborn, full of warmth, the light still burning. In that place among the trees, stories lived forever. And so did the light. Because as long as even one person remembers with love, the darkness can never fully win.